Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This webinar is being sponsored by the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, also known as SPSSI, and has been organized by SPSSI's Graduate Student Committee, which runs both a policy-focused webinar series and a methodology-focused webinar series. I'm Sarah Mancall, SPSSI's Policy Director, and I will now turn the webinar over to Lori Holleran, who is a clinical psychology intern with the San Francisco VA, and she is also a member of SPSSI's Graduate Student Committee. Lori will be serving as today's webinar facilitator.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to SPSSI's second policy webinar. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Lori Holleran, a member of SPSSI's Graduate Student Committee, and today we'll be hearing from Ph.D. student Achu Johnson Alexander and Dr. Anita Father, both of Clark University. Sarah, if we could go to the next slide. So before turning it over to our presenters, I want to share a brief overview of SPSSI and highlight some of the opportunities we offer. SPSSI, founded in 1936, is a group of 3,000 plus scientists and researchers who share common interests in research on the psychological aspects of important social and policy issues. As an organization, we aim to bring theory and practice into focus on human problems of the group, the community, and nations, as well as issues that defy national boundaries. SPSSI is an independent society and is also Division 9 of the American Psychological Association, as well as an organizational affiliate of the American Psychological Society. SPSSI welcomes membership of anyone interested in the society, and you can visit spssi.org, which is SPSSI.org, for more information or to become a member. Next slide. So, as an organization, and can we go to, okay. So as an organization, SPSSI offers its members a wide variety of opportunities in addition to offering an intellectual home, networking opportunities, conferences, awards, and fellowships. We also have a peer mentoring program, a policy and methodology webinar series that Sarah mentioned, writing opportunities in our graduate student newsletter, The Rookie, and more, all of which aim to support graduate students in their scholarly and policy-related pursuits. And our social media outlets are a great way to learn more about these opportunities. Next slide. So now I'll briefly just be introducing our speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Achu Johnson Alexander. So Achu is a fourth-year Ph.D. candidate at the Hiatt School of Psychology in Clark University. Her research interests include understanding the lives of refugees and immigrants, their reasons for migration, and present status in their new homes. She's worked with Indian American emerging adults and multiple refugee groups, both within and outside the United States. Next slide. And our co-presenter is Dr. Anita Father. Dr. Father is an anthropologist and associate professor at Clark University's International Development, Community, and Environment Department. She has worked and conducted research together with Muslim Arab Sudanese refugees in the Middle East, Europe, and the U.S. Previously, she was Director of Forced Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo, and Dr. Father's scholarship explores transnational ethnic and religious identity, race, displacement, and gender among Muslim refugees at a time of intensifying discourses of security and Islamic spiritual geography. Dr. Father is currently researching refugee displacement and humanitarian policy and practice in urban settings in the Middle East. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Hi, everyone. This is Achu, a fourth-year doctoral candidate at Clark University.
And good afternoon from Worcester, Massachusetts. This is Anita. How are you?
Today, our presentation will be titled Shared Worlds in the city of Worcester, Massachusetts. First and foremost, we'd like to thank SPSSI for conducting this policy-related series to help us all understand and learn from each other's projects and experiences. Special mention to Lori Holleran and Sarah Mankol for this opportunity to present and share our research work with other scholars. The overview of our presentation is as follows. We'll have 3 parts to the presentation. So in the first part, we will cover the rationale for the study that we did, where we will briefly summarize existing research and research gaps, after which we will discuss our methodology. In the part 2 of the presentation, we will outline our preliminary findings and the challenges we encountered with recruitment in the field. In part 3 of the presentation, we will discuss few policy implications. So we start with part 1 of the presentation, which is focused on the rationale for our study, the research gaps that we noticed, and the methodology that we devised. So Anita, I want to know from you a little bit about your inspiration behind designing the Shared Worlds project.
Well, thanks, Achu. This is actually a joint project between Clark University and Cheryl Hamilton, who's currently the Director of Partner Engagement at a resettlement agency in Massachusetts and New England called International Institute of New England. And our initial idea, this is before you joined the project, but our initial idea was to expand the study of integration beyond measurable indicators such as jobs, housing, and so forth, and explore how social integration affects individuals' abilities to achieve these needs, as well as to develop a sense of social belonging. We also recognized when we started the study in 2015 that it was a very timely study. The White House, under Barack Obama's initiative, had just launched the Task Force on Immigrant Integration. So there was quite a lot of attention being given to ideas of integration, ideas about America's immigrant history, and so forth. We also situated our project, not just because I and Achu are both located at Clark University, but Worcester, Mass. Actually has a long history of immigration. Currently, it's also seen as a gateway city for refugee resettlement. It's the largest destination in Massachusetts. And recent studies focusing on measurable integration indicators in Worcester demonstrate some of the challenges in the city, but also some of the positive characteristics. But what about some of these more intangible characteristics, such as the concept of belonging? We don't know very much about belonging. We know more about these measurable things, like access to education. But how does welcome happen? How do people feel welcome? What about the other side of the equation, which is people who are already settled in a place? What happens to their belonging when the city is transforming? And so our idea was that we were concerned to include policies that include both foreign-born and U.S.-born residents of Worcester to make it more of a multiple directional kind of study. Okay, so here we go. We have some interesting challenges among the recent immigrants to Worcester, Mass. From a couple of studies that were done in 2015 and 2016, we feel, 2014 and 2015, we found that many of the foreign-born individuals earn less than citizens, and they have a lower English proficiency. There's quite a high level of English as a second language spoken by natives or by residents of Worcester. There's also a large number of uninsured individuals, and these data come from a study by the Seven Hills Foundation. But some interesting additional characteristics of Worcester residents, and that is that there is a very high rate of employment among foreign-born residents of Worcester. In fact, a higher rate of employment and labor force participant than U.S.-born residents of Worcester. Full-time native workers, on the other hand, out-earn foreign-born workers by more than 20%. But what I wanted to point out is that Worcester is actually the largest
site of refugee resettlement in particular, so a particular type of immigrant person in the form of refugees resettled to Worcester have played a large role in the diversity of the community and some of the characteristics of the city. And currently, I think that the numbers have shifted upward a little bit, but approximately approximately a quarter of all foreign-born native residents are from refugee backgrounds.
Anita, interesting that you say that, because, next slide, because in an article that I read recently, almost 46.9% of foreign-born individuals in Worcester made the city their home recently between 1990 to 2000.
Next slide. Right, indeed. Like many other medium-sized cities, Worcester is increasingly a receiving place for foreign-born individuals, and it seems to be an upward trend going forward. From the slide that you've put up, Achu, you can see that among the foreign-born population, there is quite a large percentage of recently arrived persons. So this is a city that's constantly being refreshed and transformed by incoming residents.
Next slide. Next slide.
Okay, so I think we'll go on to our main research question for the study. So we've already described how we were interested in both U.S.-born and foreign-born, thinking about integration as a multi-directional process, not just a one-way process. And so our study really focuses on the intersection and interaction of U.S. and foreign-born people. And our idea was to explore this relationship using constituencies from across the city of Worcester and looking at the effect of their perceptions and experiences of these relationships, or their lack of relationships indeed, on their own lives.
Let me clarify this, Anita. So you mentioned foreign-born and U.S.-born. So based on these terms, I understand foreign-born as individuals who were not born in the U.S. and came to the country due to a number of reasons, while U.S.-born individuals would be those who are born and brought up on U.S. soil and are American citizens, right?
That's right. That was the basic idea of parsing the study. The reality in Worcester, of course, is a much more complex picture than U.S.-born and foreign-born residents. In fact, one of the very interesting characteristics recently has been the increase in residents who originate from Puerto Rico, which of course is considered U.S. territory and not foreign-born. But these folks make up a large part of the English as a second language learners and so on. So it's a very complex picture. Let's move on to slide 9 then. Okay. So I wanted to, again, refer to a similar study or a similar project that had been done as an action-oriented anti-bias project by my colleague, or our colleague, Cheryl Hamilton. It was called the New Migration Project, exploring a range of cities in the United States and anti-refugee bias. And we took that model and turned it into an IRB-permitted research project with trained facilitators and data collection in a more researchy kind of way. But we're hoping, of course, that this study also has policy implications, which we'll talk about a little bit in the final slides. But I would also point out that while our goal was to interview 1,000 Worcester residents through a series of focus groups, that was how we presented the study, we managed to make about half of this number, which we thought was pretty good. But initially we were hoping to reach this range of participants to ensure a wide number of community groups. We invited constituencies to present focus group groupings that we would then match up with a facilitator team to conduct a focus group discussion with about between 6 and 12 participants. And finally, the research team, which consisted of myself, Anita, Achu, who's sitting with me today, Cheryl Hamilton, who's not able to be with us, and a grad student research assistant, Patrick Seed. We recruited community members and students for our facilitator and scribe team.
Yes, I remember the timeline that we had from October 2015 to January 2016, where we started with 2 facilitator training workshops in October, after which we began data collection right away in the same month. And simultaneously, we were also identifying suitable interpreters for 6 languages, those being Burmese, Spanish, Arabic, Nepali, Swahili, and Vietnamese, for groups that did not speak English. And I also remember we recruited scribes for taking notes during these discussions, which were primarily from a classroom taught by one of the principal investigators. And our final outcome was 45 focus group discussions with 385 Worcester residents. And so these discussions were conducted with the help of 15 community facilitators, 17 scribes, and 6 interpreters. Next slide. In terms of the composition of the conversations, we had around 61% of our focus groups comprising of foreign-born individuals, while 39% of these groups comprised of US-born individuals. Next slide. In total, we had representation from 44 ethnicities and nationalities. As you can see on this slide, we had individuals who was of the nationality American to Polish to Syrian individuals. And a range of these nationalities are provided on the slides. On the next slide, we see the city of Worcester, where we indicate the different types of organizations who partnered with us. So we had faith-based organizations, we had community organizations, we had refugee service providing agencies who partnered with us. In the next slide, we see the gender composition of the focus groups that we conducted. We had 63% of females and 37% of males. Now, it is important to note that one person identified themselves as transgender, but the number was negligible to fit themselves in the pie chart. And in terms of the actual conversations, the focus groups that we conducted, we had a total of 35% groups that had foreign-born individuals exclusively. 18% of these groups had US-born individuals exclusively. And then we had 47% of mixed groups, which comprised of both US and foreign-born individuals. And some of these research questions that we had pertain to asking individuals their own perceptions or descriptions of the relationship that US and foreign-born residents in Worcester have between each other. And I think a couple of other questions that we asked reflected aspects related to what makes it easy or difficult for US and foreign-born residents to connect in Worcester. And also one of our other questions related to who holds responsibility in order to create these relationships between different groups.
All right, so we had I think you're continuing on with this section.
Right. So after we transcribed these focus groups, we had a group of 6 coders who used Atlas TI software to analyze data. And using the method outlined by Braun and Clark, we used thematic analysis to identify codes, collate similar codes, and then identify preliminary themes, which helped us then look closely at the data, revise and refine themes when needed. And this particular thematic map on the screen helps you understand how this process was done.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to move on now to some of the findings of our research. We're still in a preliminary stage of data analysis. We're still working through our report. so that we can, which will be available at some future point on our website, sharedworlds.us. But we also wanted to share with you some of the challenges that we had, both in terms of research design, but also in terms of methodology and implementation of the methodology, and some of our learnings and where we're going to go from there. So I thought first we would start with some findings. So next slide, please. Our preliminary results were very much, they're shaped along the lines of the questions that we asked, which asked people to talk about their experiences and perceptions, their ideas about relationships and interactions, and the sorts of responsibilities that they saw emerging from a sort of a proactive stance on U.S. and foreign-born relations. So one of the things that we found was that there's a kind of a mix. There's ideas about social belonging in terms of Worcester being a very welcoming place, but also some prejudice, misunderstandings, and difficulties in forming bonds across social groups. And while there was a general agreement about the changing political climate, there was much more debate around the idea of the social climate of Worcester. And I think I have some points on the next slide, please. Great. So what we found was that in equal measure, our respondents had either a strong welcoming ideas about the social climate in Worcester, or a description of Worcester as unwelcoming and closed off. So you can see from these two quotes that it didn't necessarily follow U.S.-born and foreign-born respondents. Both U.S.-born and foreign-born respondents said that Worcester was a welcoming place, and equally true was people who were from these two different groups saying that it was a closed-off place. So it was very interesting. However, people did not seem to attribute this to disparities and inequalities between the groups, or race, class, tension, and that kind of explanation. Instead, there was a lot of linking this unwelcoming or welcoming, unwelcoming tension to misconceptions and ignorance of other social groups. Many people also cited the fact that people are very, very busy. This is a characteristic, I think, of the United States more broadly, where there doesn't seem to be time to develop relationships between groups. And then some people described a neglect and a lack of community. However, even during distressing experiences that were conveyed to us in our focus group, we did find that there were a lot of shout-outs to some good people that our respondents had found. Let's see, next slide, please. Okay, so another area that we think is important to highlight is that unlike some of the previous studies that talked about immigrants as one type of social group and U.S.-born as another type of social group, we really found that Worcester has a great complexity of groups and relationships across groups. So our data found connections, but also prejudices and disconnects across a range of social groups. For example, we did a number of focus group studies in Spanish with Spanish-speaking or Spanish-speaking people who had been born in a range of countries. And they conveyed to us some of the discrimination and prejudices that exist among foreign-born residents of Worcester who are from different Spanish-speaking countries. Similarly, whereas maybe some of the ideas about race kind of collapse onto a type of phenotypical characterization, we found that African refugee or immigrant residents of Worcester did not necessarily feel themselves to be part of a Black community, even while they were being stereotyped and experiencing certain racist prejudice from other people in Worcester. But there was not very much connection between African American and African-born residents of Worcester across that boundary. And then finally, there's quite a growing profile of Muslim refugees both from the United States, born in the United States, but also born in other countries. And there's quite a lot of religious connection in the three mosques that Worcester has, but within individual communities, for example, Iraqis, there is some political tension that emerges from ongoing conflict in the country and so on. And that shouldn't be a surprise, I think, to many of us. All right, so let's move to the next slide. Good. Okay. So one of the ideas that came out from a strong perception of people is that language and not knowing another person's language is a very big barrier. And again, highlighting the issue that this is not just a one-way street, we found a lot of English speakers wishing that they had language abilities in other languages so that they could communicate. So language was a tool of communication in our study, and not only a requirement of participating in English-speaking institutions and events and activities. So we found that it was the most important medium for connecting with others, how important it was to speak a common language. And let's see. Sorry, next slide, please. Thanks. Great. So our takeaway message from the initial data is that the social climate in Worcester is not one thing or the other and doesn't break down easily between foreign-born and U.S.-born. Rather, there's much more of a mixed perception of the social climate here. A lot of discussion that's quite U.S.-based, I guess, this idea of busyness, which is the bane of all of our existence in the United States, but also that there were some very welcoming and good people that crossed boundaries. And a real complexity in Worcester that reflects the demographic shifts, the increasing diversity of settlement in Worcester, and the importance of language as social capital. So let's go to the next slide. Great. So now, while we had some project strengths, and we think that we benefited from some of the innovation of the research question, we did have some challenges in the way that the research actually was implemented. And I think Achu is going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced in particular as one of the key facilitators of that research.
Right. Thank you, Anita. I think my major issue was with the interpretation of integration, the word integration itself. Because what I found was many organizations, many groups consisting of US-born individuals often interpreted integration, the word integration, as something for refugees/immigrants, but not necessarily for native residents themselves. And so I think it brings attention to the way in which we currently define integration, because Anita, as you rightly mentioned a couple of slides ago, that integration can no longer be considered as a unidirectional effort, but it has to have a multi-directional piece to it. And so and I think that relates to this another challenge that we had in terms of recruiting certain groups of residents in Worcester itself. Like, for example, African Americans, we had their voices missing in these focus group conversations that we had. And also we had challenges related to recruiting students from public schools. While in this case, we actually had the consent of the research director, but there was no real action from individual schools. The principals were not very forthcoming in partnering with us. So I think we're missing that piece, that vital piece, the experiences of adolescents, young people in public schools. And I think another important issue that we faced was related to having a conversation with government officials. Though we had the support from the mayor's office, there was a general reluctance for officials to actually participate in a conversation. Organizations were also, in general, reluctant to participate and hold a conversation. I think I kind of understand why they would have faced that reluctance to actually participate, because one could be in terms of the fear of representing the organization in a negative light, especially if there were some politically inappropriate statements that were made, or even the timing of the study. We had such a short window that we couldn't really get out there and get these individuals to participate. And I think the timing of the study is something that we can talk about a little further in one of the next few slides. But another broad challenge was related to the management of human resources. So what I mean by that is one part relates to matching the facilitator with each focus group. So let's say we have a foreign-born group, and we have a US-born facilitator who's willing to facilitate that particular conversation. The question then arose if group members would be comfortable to share their real experiences in the presence of an outsider, the US-born facilitator. But on the other hand, the dilemma was that having such a situation would actually be advantageous, because the US-born facilitator, as an outsider to the foreign-born experiences, is likely to prod and follow up on their statements. And I think another challenge that we faced was related to translators. As I mentioned a couple of slides ago, we had interpreters that we had on standby for groups that did not speak English, but there was also this difficulty of training these individuals to actually relay back the information in an appropriate way, because we faced a situation where individuals were not really being honest when they were translating information in non-English speaking groups. So we found that data could have been fudged as a result. And so I think one key aspect that we faced was in terms of translator training, as well as their availability with certain groups that needed to be done on particular timelines. What about you, Anita? What were some of the challenges that you faced?
Well, I think it had to do with the fact that we did this study as a sort of a pilot study within a university context. So we didn't have a big grant. We had funding from the Mazikowski Institute of Public Enterprise, thanks to their interest in the development of medium-sized cities. And we also had some support from SPSSI, and we had some support from the International Development and Community and Environment Department. So it was very much of a sort of a small-scale study. So we used the resources that we had, meaning that while we did have money to pay facilitators, we used scribes from a class that one of us was teaching. And through the classwork, they did get some kind of training in data collection and note-taking and things like that. And they were very gracious and wonderful in going out and pairing with facilitators to conduct these focus group discussions. But then our data came back, despite our best attempts to have a template, some of the data came back a bit messy, so that was difficult. So we, for example, we didn't consistently get gender on all of the focus groups and so forth. And then I would also say that because it was a small-scale study, all of the main principal investigators were doing it in addition to all of their other responsibilities. So there was no research leave for any of us while we tried to coordinate quite a detailed and complex study, right? Next slide, please. And then we had, I think Achu talked a little bit about the timing of the study. Interestingly, Worcester has been doing a lot of thinking itself as a city, and the policy leaders have been talking mainly around issues of race and race awareness, and there was a dialogue on race that was conducted by the Mayor's Office Human Rights Directorship from May to July in 2015, and our study came right on the tail end of that. And so on the one hand, we thought, oh, this is another dimension of some of the work that Worcester is doing anyway, but it also turned out that people weren't very clear about what the difference was that we were trying to do, and they were already, they had already participated in a number of community discussions through the dialogue on race, so they weren't that interested in participating in our study. It also has to be said that holiday season is a difficult time to conduct research when people are busy and trying to finish up for the holidays. And then finally, this is a characteristic of a lot of university-based action research such as this, which is that our semester and our research assistants were essentially students who had their own semester schedule to adhere to and their own final exams to think about, and so we lost some of the willingness to go out at a last minute to conduct a focus group discussion that we had been able to manage. It did work out. The students were wonderful, but at the same time, community organizations have ongoing activities, and it doesn't necessarily fit the semester schedule. So that was another methodological challenge. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So I think I said something about the difference and difficulty of doing two things at once. So on the one hand, we've collected some very rich data for doing a kind of a grounded theorizing of people's ideas about belonging and so forth as a research project. But at the same time, we want this project to have results that can be operationalized by policymakers or other interested stakeholders. And so there have been some issues between, how to frame the results of the study for people who need to take action versus people who are interested in thinking more deeply about issues of belonging and social cohesion. So how to make that academic matter accessible. And then finally, this is a challenge for all of us, right, which is that doing proper field research really is time-consuming. It takes all the time that it needs to take, and that's just sometimes we don't have that time, and that was definitely a challenge that we faced. So, great. So I think, Achu, we'll move finally to a few of the policy implications that might emerge from this study. I think we only have about 1 more minute for that, so I'll try to speak quickly. We have two major ideas that come out. One is a national level idea, and one is more on the local level. And so I think the first is that our study takes a gentle look at the American story of immigration that we all know, and suggests that, as Achu was saying earlier, that policymakers start really considering integration not as a one-way process, not sort of like that, how do you like it here, question that a lot of foreign-born people get consistently by U.S.-born folks, but rather that we see integration as a multi-directional process that involves everyone in a community and not just newcomers. Currently, our national policies are largely based on a very instrumental idea of integration into a sort of a stable existing society. And rather, I think what we want to propose is that if one of our policy goals is to create a sense of ownership and belonging and participatory, interaction, that we really have to think about how to create conditions for belonging. Even though this idea is harder to measure than how many immigrants are learning English, how many immigrants have access to health care, et cetera, I think that to go forward as communities and on the national level, we really have to look at this in a different way. But I think our study also shows that Worcester is doing a lot of things right. There are clear signals that while it's certainly not perfect, both foreign-born and U.S. residents really appreciate some of the opportunities that they shared with us to nurture relationships across boundaries, and this gets at the local level policy implications of our study. Even though our data clearly shows that Worcester has complex social relations across multiple groups of people, both foreign-born and U.S.-born, even though other cities may be different, I think that we do have some lessons that we can share about the rise of complexity in the United States, especially in some of these medium-sized cities. Some scholars have called this super diversity or micro-plurality, and it really does pose some policy challenges for schools, for sites of interaction and relationship building. One of the things that we think policymakers could proactively do is to find ways to develop these public and private sites based on our research on what residents in Worcester think that works well. Additionally, we think that Worcester service providers have actually taken some steps to address the importance of that third finding that we had, the importance of language learning as a cultural capital. And we just want to give a final shout out to people such as the Director of English Language Learning in the Worcester Public Schools, Berta Elena Rojas, and also Ann Bureau of Worcester Community Connections. Together with their colleagues, they've been doing a lot of work to create an inventory of English as an additional language offerings and tailoring the provision of these services to Worcester's unique characteristics. So I think there's a lot going on in Worcester that's really positive, and we hope that this ongoing conversation around the relationship building that our participants really shared with us can be harnessed for going forward as a city and as a community. So now we are on to questions, right? Yes. Great.
Thank you so much for all. Thanks so much for all of you who's attending this webinar. This is our contact information if you need to know more information regarding our research, and also do visit our website, sharedworlds.us. We are in the process of updating the website, so please bear with us during this intermission.
That's right, and that's where our research results will be shared as well, so you can visit that to find out about the final study when we get that up.
Over to Lori.
Great. So thank you for that presentation, Achu and Anita. It was really interesting. I just want to encourage any of our participants, if you have questions, to just type them into that box on the lower left-hand corner. And there were a few that came in that I'll jump to now. So Paula asked if there are any concerns with Trump's agenda on deportation.
So sure. This study was done in the run-up to the election, and there were certainly qualms that were shared with us about the political climate. And it was really interesting how the political climate was seen as something that some people were tapping into, but that there was a great deal of support for the social climate as something different from the political climate. One of the potential next steps that Achu and I have been talking about is actually doing a follow-up series of focus groups to address exactly these questions and to be able to compare people's responses and sense of belonging now in this new climate where there has been the stepped-up deportation regime coming to cities. So thank you for that question, Paula.
Great. And Hadia, I hope I pronounced that right, was wondering, so she said it's not so much a question, but just a possible consideration about using participatory action research. And did you guys consider any additional models in your research?
Right. I think that's a great question. And I think the study that this was modeled on was a participatory action project with quite an engaged, a kind of a joint project between city leaders and city constituencies. That was the hope. So we did have a participatory mechanism, but in terms of action, we did frame it as a research study with hope for action points for policymakers, but not as a participatory action research project. But it would certainly be an option for addressing some of these questions going forward.
Great. And then Kristin had a question noting, do you have any suggestions for engaging public schools in conversations about their part in integration?
I can take a shot at that. We had a really wonderful relationship with the Director of Research at the Worcester Public Schools, whose second name is escaping me right now. He's David, and he was very supportive and very helpful in getting us research permission to do research at the public schools. I think maybe a combination of Hadia's question might have helped us there. So if we had been able to partner with schools at a better time of the year and maybe work these kinds of focus group discussions into existing curriculum, I think that would have gone a great way forward for engaging not just the students but also the teachers, parents of students, administrators in schools, because these are a critical element of the new sites of interaction and belonging that's actually marked and flagged in the research results that we had coming out of the focus group analysis. So it does make a lot of sense to move in that direction, and so I think one of the implementation takeaways for us would be to try again to work in a different way with the school system, perhaps starting from the fall. And in fact, we do have a trio of Ph.D. students at Clark University who are interested in tailoring some of their research questions towards the model of belonging and integration as a multidimensional framework. So thank you for that idea.
Anita, I just want to add one small bit to what Anita was saying. I think a big lesson for me was in terms of having ongoing relationships with community partners. Just going up there, asking for permission did not really help. As I mentioned earlier, we had the support of the research director, but we really didn't get real action from the principals themselves. So having these constituencies within where you're located, like as Anita was mentioning, there are PhD students actually working with Worcester Public Schools, getting them to partner with you. So finding these connections that way is going to be very beneficial instead of just walking up there and saying, this is my project and this is what I need help with. So I feel like that those ongoing community connections have to be established first before we actually go out and actually seek community partners in action research such as shared worlds.
Well, I think you make a really good point, Achu, and I want to loop back into the previous model for this research, which was a federally mandated program. It was a grant that the anti-refugee bias research or action team received, and their model was they worked with the city, and the city mandated different community organizations to have these kinds of focus groups, whereas we came in very much as a research team. Right. And I think people felt less of an urgency and less of a stake in helping us, produce research, even if it was action research. I think it really does matter who is conducting the research, and the anti-bias team had a lot more, I wouldn't say, perhaps buy-in, but also, even though they didn't know anybody, and they did parachute into Boise, and they did come in, without any on-the-ground knowledge of these cities, but they did have teams of people who did advanced work for them. So it was a very different kind of approach than our research approach.
Yeah, and so take advantage of community meetings that might be happening in your city, in your local areas, so that you can make yourself known. That's something strongly I suggest, because Dr. FÁbos already has an established connection, and so it made our research much more easier. And so being engaged with the community would be a great first step in order to do participatory action research.
Well,
Thank you for those insights. And so Hadia came back and had another question, noting, was social desirability addressed with participants as a way to possibly reduce the barrier with participants and normalize a range of opinions?
I don't think so. I think we were we were asking questions in a neutral way and focusing on their particular experiences. That might be, I mean, this is not an area that I know well. Maybe Achu has something to say about that. But we are leaving it, I guess, to the policymakers to decide how they might implement some of these observations that our participants made.
Yes, to that question, I think it is highly possible that there was social desirability, but I think we tried and matched groups as far as possible based on where individuals were comfortable in, their comfortable spaces. So we ensured that individuals felt welcome and had the freedom to actually voice what they wanted to. And so that is how we did things on our end in order to make sure that individuals felt comfortable enough. But I also remember some focus groups where there were points of view that differed between group members, and it was often done in a cordial way where the foreign-born individuals were educated through that process, as well as U.S.-born individuals were educated through those conversations that happened. Because it also gave these individuals an opportunity to actually talk about these issues, because often these were individuals who belonged to a church where they came together to worship, but no discussion really about racial issues were actually raised in these spaces. So what I want to say is that it is highly possible that social desirability might have happened, but at the same time, we tried to match groups based on what individuals were comfortable with within their own communities and memberships.
Okay. And I know that you spoke about the importance of partnerships with the community. And earlier you were highlighting the importance of English. And I was wondering if you noted any differences in the resource connectedness while these services are available in the community. Did you notice any differences in how they were being accessed across different cultures?
No, I think the studies that we noted earlier did more of that kind of access research to find out where there were areas of lesser connectivity. Our research was I guess we had our sample frame that was based on different kinds of constituencies, and we went out and reached out to those constituencies to find out if they would talk to us about their concepts of relationships. But in terms of asking them or doing any additional research on their access to services and differences in access, we didn't do that work in this particular study.
Okay. And we had another question come in from Audrey, and again, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I do apologize. Wondering if standard English was a concern about using that amongst those who were foreign-born English-speaking participants in terms of their belonging?
That's a great question, and I think we used translators whenever possible so that people could speak in their own, in their first language or their most comfortable language. In some of the mixed groups, we had ranges of different abilities in the English language. So I guess that would be, between standard English and other, different abilities in English. I guess what we would say is that we tried to train our facilitators to really be able to listen and not to jump to conclusions, and to be able to facilitate misunderstandings on a language level. I know that this takes a lot of practice, but that was the way that we addressed that particular challenge, I guess.
Okay, and there was a second part to that question, wondering if addressing the standard English bias in the U.S.-born population could be another policy area. And did you have any thoughts on that?
I guess that I personally have thoughts, I guess, and I think it's a very interesting direction that the findings of this study could help with, because the role of language in connecting was such a common finding, and it's so tricky, right? Because even your own sense of how well you speak English and this came out again and again in the findings. People felt shy to be able to connect or interact with another person because of their concerns and worries about their own English abilities. I think that definitely the Worcester Public School System and some of the work that they've been doing seems to be innovative and inclusive of different types of English. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Worcester and how the increasing diversity, not just of people, but of different languages. One of the things that people who work with refugees often note is that just because somebody comes to the United States as a refugee does not mean that they don't speak English. So they, for example, there's at least a few folks from Uganda in our study, and in their on their data form, I would say that their first language is English, even though they came to this country as a foreign-born person. So those kinds of things. One last point that maybe we could share with you, because I think it was I think it was quite innovative and fun also, but a challenge. We first shared the results of this study at the Worcester Senior Center with the director, Amy Waters, on a grant that she received on access to activities for immigrant elders. And we had a rollout of our initial results of the study with simultaneous translation in 5 different languages. It was really something. We had headsets for different groups of language speakers and their translator. We clustered people by language at the different tables in the community hall. I think we had about 150 participants in this community meeting, and it was really quite something, because I think people felt included, even if they weren't speaking in the dominant language they were hearing. They were translating. Their translator was able to share their responses to the questions that we asked. We made the community meeting very interactive, so it wasn't just a bunch of talking heads sharing results of a study on stage, but we had interactive activities to perform around each other's tables in their own language. So I think that was another way that we feel that we could model the engagement across linguistic barriers in a diverse place like Worcester.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you for sharing. I just wanted to extend a big thank you to our presenters, Achu Johnson Alexander and Dr. Anita Father, for this engaging talk, and thank you to all of you who attended. I'd like to extend a special thanks to the Policy Committee and the Graduate Student Committee. In particular, I'd like to thank Sarah Manclaw, our Policy Director, and Cindy Lucas, our Communications Director, for coordinating and promoting this webinar. Also, just a reminder to check out our social media accounts to access and review this presentation and learn more about future webinars and other opportunities offered by SPSSI. And now I'll turn it over to Sarah for closing remarks.
To conclude today's webinar, I would like to first thank our amazing presenters, Ph.D. candidate Achu Johnson Alexander and Dr. Anita FÁbos, and our webinar facilitator, Lori Holleran of SPSSI's Graduate Student Committee. And please note, as listed on this final slide, SPSSI will be sponsoring or co-sponsoring 2 upcoming webinars on Tuesday. One is methodology focused and one is immigration focused. So we can continue the immigration research and policy conversation on Tuesday with Dr. Luis Zayas, who is a psychologist and dean of the School of Social Work at UT Austin, and Wendy Cervantes, who's a senior policy analyst at the Center for Law and Social Policy here in Washington. Shortly after this webinar ends, I will send attendees a PDF copy of today's slides, links to register for our 2 upcoming webinars, and a link to SPSSI's YouTube channel, where a recording of today's webinar will be posted within the next 24 hours. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that we will see you at one of our future webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you.